April 17, 1945, somewhere over the shattered plains of Bavaria, where spring struggled to reclaim Earth scorched by total war. The P-47 Thunderbolt descended through morning haze, its pilot scanning the landscape with eyes trained not in aviation academies, but in the deer stands and rabbit runs of rural Arkansas. Second Lieutenant James Quayle Morrison had entered combat 6 months prior, carrying a skill the Army Air Forces considered irrelevant. The patience of a subsistence hunter who'd learned to track movement in peripheral vision, to distinguish machine from nature by the wrongness of angles, to wait for the single perfect moment when stillness breaks into certainty. His squadron mates called his technique Morrison's crawl, the inexplicable ability to spot camouflaged armor that reconnaissance photos missed, to predict vehicle paths by reading terrain like a woodsman reads game trails, to hold fire until the instant when geometry and vulnerability aligned. The brass had dismissed it as luck. The tank crews he hunted learned otherwise. By war's end, this son of Depression-era poverty would be credited with 37 confirmed armored vehicle kills, more than any other American fighter pilot in the European theater, using a method that began with his father's words, "Boy, don't hunt what moves. Hunt where it has to go." In the winter of 1943, the Army Air Forces faced a problem their doctrine hadn't anticipated. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs dominating European skies were being increasingly diverted to ground attack missions, strafing runs against German armor that was flowing toward the front, faster than strategic bombing could interdict supply lines. Pilots trained for air-to-air combat found themselves diving at 80-degree angles toward targets that could kill them with a single well-placed flak round. The learning curve was written in burning wreckage across French hedgerows and German forests. Standard doctrine emphasized speed and aggression. Locate enemy columns through visual reconnaissance. Radio for fighter-bomber support. Execute high-speed passes with rockets and .50 caliber fire. Hit hard, hit fast, disengage before anti-aircraft batteries could track you. It worked reasonably well against convoys on open roads. Against dispersed camouflaged armor positioned in defensive terrain, it was almost useless. James Morrison arrived at his assigned squadron, the 513th Fighter Squadron, 406th Fighter Group, in October 1944, one of hundreds of replacement pilots feeding the insatiable appetite of the air war. His personnel file noted adequate performance in gunnery training and satisfactory navigation skills. Nothing suggested distinction. His background, son of a sharecropper who'd supplemented Depression-era meals with hunted game, merited no mention in military records. The only unusual notation came from a training officer who'd watched Morrison practice recognition drills. Shows unusual patience. Sometimes takes too long to identify targets. His squadron commander, Major Robert Hendricks, assigned him to ground attack rotation with standard instructions. Follow your element leader, stay aggressive, don't fixate on single targets. Morrison flew his first 6 missions executing doctrine perfectly. Fast passes against reported concentrations, firing at anything that resembled armor, disengaging when tracers rose to meet him. His gun camera footage showed the same scattered results most pilots achieved. Probable hits, possible damage, nothing confirmable. On his 7th mission, something changed. Or rather, Morrison stopped trying to hunt tanks the way the Air Forces taught him, and started hunting them the way his father had taught him to hunt white-tailed deer in the Ozark Hills. He stopped looking for movement. He started reading the terrain for where movement had to occur. The distinction would rewrite ground attack doctrine and create a legend that military historians still study 80 years later. The fundamental problem with tank hunting from aircraft was simple. Tanks didn't want to be found. By 1944, German armor commanders understood that Allied air superiority meant daytime movement invited death. They developed elaborate concealment techniques, positioning vehicles under tree cover, draping camouflage nets that mimicked natural patterns, moving only during weather that grounded aircraft or in darkness. When they had to traverse open ground, they did so in short dashes between covered positions. American pilots hunted by searching for visual signatures, the unnatural straight lines of vehicles, dust plumes from movement, sun glinting off metal, the dark rectangles of open hatches. It was reactive hunting, waiting for the prey to reveal itself through action. Against skilled opponents employing disciplined camouflage, it meant flying for hours, burning fuel, exposing yourself to ground fire, and returning with empty gun cameras. Morrison's hunting experience had taught him different principles. In the hardscrabble hills where he'd grown up, Deer were scarce and ammunition expensive. You couldn't afford to walk the woods hoping to stumble across game. You had to think like the animal, understand where water was, where food grew, where bedding areas lay, where terrain funneled movement into predictable paths. You didn't hunt the deer. You hunted the invisible corridors the deer had to use. On November 3, 1944, Morrison's element was assigned armed reconnaissance over a sector southwest of Metz, where intelligence reported German armor moving to reinforce defensive positions. Standard procedure: fly low-level search patterns, watch for movement, engage targets of opportunity. His element leader, a veteran captain named Vickers, led them in the prescribed sweeps, crisscrossing valleys and roads at 1,500 feet, scanning for vehicles. Morrison requested permission to break formation and try something different. Vickers, frustrated by 2 hours of fruitless searching, agreed. What happened next would become the first documented example of what the intelligence section would later term predictive terrain hunting. Morrison didn't search randomly. He pulled out his map and studied the topography, not for current enemy positions, but for the places tanks had to go if they were moving toward the front. He identified choke points, bridges over rivers too deep to ford, road intersections where multiple approach routes converged, defiles where hillsides forced vehicles onto narrow paths, forest edges where concealment ended and open ground began. Then he went hunting for tanks where they hadn't been seen yet, but where geometry insisted they would eventually appear. Morrison climbed to 8,000 feet, higher than typical strafing altitude, and flew a wide orbit around a particular river, crossing 15 miles behind the reported front line. On his map, this bridge was one of only 3 points where German armor could cross a minor tributary if moving from suspected staging areas toward Metz. Reconnaissance photos showed nothing unusual. No vehicles, no fresh track marks. Standard doctrine would have ignored it. But Morrison had learned patience in deer stands where hours of motionless waiting preceded seconds of action. He'd learned that game didn't materialize randomly. It appeared where food, water, and survival instincts created certainty. Tanks, he reasoned, operated under similar constraints. They couldn't cross rivers except at bridges. They couldn't traverse steep hillsides. They consumed fuel, which meant they took efficient routes. They needed concealment during daylight, which meant they used covered approaches. He circled for 20 minutes, an eternity in combat operations, burning fuel and squadron patience. Then, at the edge of his peripheral vision, he caught something that wasn't quite right. In a tree line 200 yards from the bridge approach, the pattern of shadows had a geometric regularity that nature didn't create. He descended to 3,000 feet, making a single careful pass. There, concealed under camouflage netting and positioned in tree-line shadows, 4 German tanks, probably Panthers judging by the size, positioned in a holding area, waiting for darkness before attempting the river crossing. They were invisible from ground level, nearly invisible from directly above, but from Morrison's oblique angle, the unnatural spacing of the shadows, the slight distortion where netting met natural foliage, created a pattern his hunting-trained eye recognized as wrongness. He didn't attack immediately. Standard doctrine said strike fast before they could react. Morrison's hunting instinct said wait for the perfect setup, the moment when target and terrain aligned to maximize damage and minimize risk. He climbed back to altitude and continued watching. 40 minutes later, patience was rewarded. As late afternoon shadows lengthened, 1 tank emerged from concealment and moved toward the bridge, a test run, checking the crossing before committing the group. Morrison rolled into his dive. Single target, isolated from support, caught in the open on a narrow approach ramp with nowhere to maneuver. His first burst of .50 caliber fire stitched across the rear deck where armor was thinnest. The Panther shuddered, smoked, and died before its crew could even traverse their turret toward the sky. The gun camera footage reached squadron intelligence within hours. What impressed analysts wasn't the kill itself. Fighter pilots scored armor kills with reasonable regularity, but the circumstances. Morrison had found concealed vehicles in an area not flagged by reconnaissance, had somehow predicted their location, and had executed his attack with impatience that contradicted every principle of aggressive fighter operations. Major Hendricks called Morrison to squadron operations. How'd you know they were there? Morrison struggled to articulate hunting instincts that felt obvious to him, but alien to military thinking. They had to be there, sir, or somewhere close. Look, he spread a map on the operations table. Intelligence says they're moving armor toward Metz. To get there from their rear areas, they have to cross this river. There's 3 bridges they could use. This one's too close to our artillery range. This one's already destroyed. That leaves this crossing. And if they're smart, and German tankers are smart, they're not going to sit on the east bank where they're exposed. They'll position in these tree lines. His finger traced the terrain, where they've got cover, sight lines to the bridge, and multiple fallback routes. Hendrik studied the map. The logic was simple, almost embarrassingly so once articulated, but it required thinking about tank movement not as random events to react to, but as predictable patterns governed by terrain and tactical necessity. It was Hunter's logic. The prey must drink, therefore hunt near water. The deer must bed in cover, therefore check the thickets. You learned this hunting rabbits in Arkansas? Deer, mostly, and not much else we could afford. Morrison's voice carried no pride, just statement of fact. You don't find deer by wandering around hoping to see one. You figure out where they have to go, and you wait there. Within a week, Hendricks had Morrison briefing other pilots on what intelligence officers were starting to call terrain-based predictive hunting. The concept was simple. The execution required something the Air Forces hadn't trained: the ability to read landscapes not as backgrounds for combat, but as 3-dimensional puzzles where physics, geometry, and tactical necessity created inevitable paths. Morrison flew 6 more missions that month. Each time he studied maps not for enemy positions, but for terrain features that would funnel, constrain, or predict movement. His kill rate climbed from average to exceptional. More importantly, he was finding tanks that reconnaissance had missed, armor positioned in staging areas, camouflaged in supposedly clear sectors, moving along routes that doctrine considered unlikely. The transformation of Morrison's method from individual technique to squadron-wide doctrine began with cartography. Intelligence officers provided him with detailed topographic maps, bridge surveys, road network analyses, even pre-war railway schedules that indicated historic transportation corridors. Morrison absorbed it all with the intensity of a hunter learning new territory. He began creating what he called prediction maps, standard tactical maps overlaid with colored pencil annotations showing high-probability armor routes, likely staging areas, defensive position options, and natural choke points. Before each mission, he studied these maps for 30 minutes, visualizing the terrain from ground level, imagining where he would position tanks if he commanded German armor. Other pilots started requesting copies. Captain Vickers, initially skeptical, flew 2 missions using Morrison's prediction maps and scored 3 confirmed kills, more than he'd achieved in the previous month of random searching. Word spread through the fighter group. Soon Morrison was conducting informal briefings, teaching pilots to read terrain the way he'd learned to read Arkansas hillsides. The method had limitations. It worked best in terrain with natural constraints, river valleys, mountain passes, urban areas where road networks were limited. In open plains or featureless farmland, prediction became harder. Weather complicated everything. Low clouds prevented the altitude needed for Morrison's scanning technique, and the method demanded patience that contradicted pilots' training and temperament. Many struggled with Morrison's practice of orbiting for 20 or 30 minutes, watching and waiting, burning fuel while other flights were engaging targets. But the results were undeniable. By December 1944, the 406th Fighter Group's ground attack effectiveness had increased 40%. Not because pilots were better shooters, but because they were finding targets more efficiently. Fewer sorties were returning with no targets located reports. More importantly, pilot losses to ground fire decreased. Morrison's method emphasized attacking when geometry favored survival, catching armor in vulnerable positions rather than diving into prepared defensive zones. The technique reached higher command attention when E-8 Fighter Command analyzed November-December kill statistics. One pilot, Morrison, had 17 confirmed armor kills in 8 weeks. The squadron average was 4. When investigators interviewed Morrison and reviewed his methods, they recognized something that challenged fundamental assumptions about air-ground combat. They'd been training pilots to react to enemy actions. Morrison was teaching them to predict enemy necessities. By January 1945, fighter groups across the theater were receiving briefings on predictive terrain hunting. The technique wouldn't work for everyone. It required patience, terrain reading skills, and instincts that couldn't be taught in classrooms. But for pilots with the right temperament, it transformed tank hunting from frustrated searching to systematic prediction. February 12, 1945. The weather had been miserable for a week. Low ceilings, freezing rain, conditions that grounded most air operations. German armor was moving during these windows, knowing Allied fighters couldn't reach them. When a brief clearing appeared in the forecast, 8th Fighter Command launched maximum effort missions to catch enemy movement that had been building for days. Morrison led a 4-ship flight into a sector southeast of Cologne. Intelligence reported major armor movements, possibly an entire Panzer division repositioning, but weather was already deteriorating. They'd have perhaps 40 minutes of usable visibility before clouds closed in again. Standard procedure would be to split up, cover maximum area, engage whatever targets appeared. Morrison proposed something different. He'd studied reports of German movement patterns during bad weather. Armor commanders knew they had limited time before air threat returned. They'd move fast, using major roads for speed rather than dispersing into concealment. And with pressure from both western and eastern fronts, German logistics were strained. Vehicles would be following efficient routes, not wandering. Morrison identified 3 major road intersections in their sector. These weren't random crossroads. They were junction points where multiple supply routes converged, where traffic from rear areas had to pass to reach forward positions. During good weather, German vehicles would avoid these obvious bottlenecks. But under time pressure with weather protection, they might risk concentration for speed. His flight arrived at the first intersection. Empty. The second, nothing. They were burning fuel fast. 40 minutes had become 30. Other flights were reporting scattered contacts, a few trucks, some soft-skinned vehicles, nothing significant. Morrison's flight was 0 for 2 with time running out. The third intersection lay at the edge of their operational range. Morrison's wingman, Lieutenant Kowalski, voiced what everyone was thinking. "Quail, we push much further. We'll be swimming home." Morrison checked his fuel gauge. It would be tight. Real tight. But something in the terrain geometry felt right. This intersection sat where a major north-south route crossed an east-west supply line. If German armor was consolidating for defensive operations, logic said they'd use this junction. 5 more minutes, Morrison transmitted. Then we break. They arrived at the intersection at 1,400 feet, beneath a ceiling that was dropping rapidly, and there, caught in that brief window between weather systems, was the largest concentration of German armor Morrison had seen in 5 months of combat. Over 30 vehicles, tanks, self-propelled guns, half-tracks, staged at the intersection, waiting for darkness before final movement to frontline positions. What happened next became one of the most analyzed strafing attacks of the European air war. Morrison faced an impossible tactical equation: 30-plus armored vehicles, limited ammunition, 4 aircraft, deteriorating weather, and minimal fuel for extended engagement. Standard doctrine said, call for reinforcements, mark the position, disengage. But weather was closing fast. Reinforcements might never reach the target, and 30 tanks in a single location represented a concentration that could punch through Allied lines if it reached deployment positions. Morrison made a decision that combined hunting instinct with tactical calculation. He didn't attack the armor itself, not initially. Instead, he studied the intersection's geometry. The vehicles were staged along 2 intersecting roads, creating a rough cross pattern. They weren't dispersed. German commanders had prioritized speed of reassembly over defensive spacing. That concentration created vulnerability, but only if exploited precisely. Morrison identified the critical point: a narrow bridge at the southern approach to the intersection. Every vehicle positioned south of the intersection, roughly half the concentration, would have to cross that bridge to rejoin their unit or retreat. It was a choke point within a choke point. "We take the bridge first," he transmitted. "Kowalski, you're with me. Patterson and Miller, hold high. When they scatter, you work the dispersal." They dove in trail formation. Morrison's first pass focused entirely on the bridge structure. Not the vehicles, not the troops, just the span itself. His .50 caliber fire stitched across the roadbed and supports. Kowalski followed, adding rockets. The bridge didn't collapse. It was sturdier than they'd hoped, but it sustained enough damage that heavy vehicles couldn't risk crossing. The effect was immediate. The German formation, caught exposed and now divided, began dispersing rapidly. Tanks that had been clustered for efficient movement were suddenly seeking individual concealment. Panic worked in Morrison's favor. Vehicles scattered in multiple directions, some toward the compromised bridge, others toward secondary routes Morrison had already mapped mentally as bottlenecks. For the next 12 minutes, Morrison's flight worked the scattering formation with methodical efficiency. They weren't trying to destroy every vehicle, Ammunition and fuel wouldn't allow it. Instead, Morrison directed his pilots to damage vehicles at critical points. The lead tank in a column attempting to exit along a narrow road, the vehicle blocking an intersection, the self-propelled gun that might provide anti-aircraft cover for others. When fuel finally forced disengagement, they destroyed or disabled 11 armored vehicles and left the remaining concentration scattered, disorganized, and trapped in an area Allied artillery could reach within hours. The February 12th engagement made Morrison's name known beyond fighter pilot circles. Ground forces commanders who'd grown frustrated with air-ground coordination suddenly wanted to understand how one flight had achieved what entire squadron-strength missions often failed to accomplish. The answer, patient prediction combined with terrain exploitation tactics, challenged assumptions about how air power should be employed, but Morrison's method was creating unintended tensions. Some veteran pilots resented a relative newcomer being held up as an example, particularly one whose technique contradicted aggressive fighter pilot culture. The ethos emphasized speed, aggression, and offensive spirit. Morrison's patient circling, his willingness to let targets pass while waiting for perfect geometry, felt almost passive to pilots trained to dive toward any enemy they spotted. Captain Dietrich, a flight leader with 15 confirmed air-to-air kills before transitioning to ground attack, voiced the criticism directly. "We're fighter pilots, not birdwatchers. Morrison gets results because he's flying a different war, one where you circle for half an hour studying maps. That's fine when you've got clear skies and no fighters jumping you, but it's not repeatable doctrine." There was truth in Dietrich's complaint. Morrison's method worked best under conditions that weren't always available: adequate altitude for observation, time to study terrain, weather clear enough for patient searching, in fluid combat situations where enemy fighters contested airspace, or during close air support missions where ground forces needed immediate response. His predictive hunting was less applicable. What Dietrich and others missed, but what analysts at the 8th Fighter Command recognized, was that Morrison wasn't proposing replacement doctrine. He was demonstrating supplementary capability. Not every mission suited predictive hunting, but armed reconnaissance and interdiction missions, which constituted perhaps 40% of fighter operations by early 1945, could be revolutionized by pilots who understood how terrain constrained movement. The real transformation came when intelligence officers began integrating Morrison's approach into mission planning. Instead of simply designating search sectors and hoping pilots found targets, they began identifying high-probability locations based on terrain analysis, supply route mapping, and defensive position evaluation. They gave pilots not just areas to search, but specific locations where enemy movement was geometrically probable. Morrison flew 9 more missions in February, scoring 12 additional confirmed kills. His total reached 29, approaching records set by pilots who'd been flying combat for twice as long. But more significantly, pilots trained in his methods were achieving similar results. The technique was proving replicable, not universal, but effective enough that squadron commanders were designating specific flights for predictive interdiction missions. March 1945. The Allied advance was accelerating as German defenses crumbled under combined pressure from east and west. Armor that had dominated defensive positions was now increasingly caught in retreats, withdrawals, and desperate attempts to establish new defensive lines. For pilots hunting tanks, the tactical situation created both opportunity and danger. More movement meant more targets, but also more desperation, more unpredictability, more risk. Morrison recognized that his predictive method needed adaptation. Retreating armies don't follow the same logic as advancing or defending ones. Choke points were still valuable, but now you hunted not where enemy armor should go based on tactical advantage, but where it had to go based on geographic necessity and collapsing options. He began studying evacuation routes with the same intensity he'd applied to approach routes. Which bridges remained intact behind German lines? Which road networks could handle heavy vehicle traffic? Where would retreating columns face inevitable bottlenecks as multiple units converged on limited routes westward? The intelligence picture was fragmentary. German communications were disrupted, their formations scattered. Traditional reconnaissance struggled to predict where armor would appear because German commanders themselves often didn't know until retreat orders arrived. But Morrison realized that regardless of orders, physics and geography created certainties. Retreating armor had to avoid encirclement, had to use roads capable of bearing weight. had to funnel through river crossings, had to avoid areas where Allied ground forces had already advanced. On March 23rd, Morrison proposed an experimental mission. Instead of searching for current enemy positions, he wanted to pre-position his flight near a river crossing 12 miles behind German lines. Intelligence had no reports of enemy activity in that sector. Reconnaissance photos showed the bridge intact but unused. Standard targeting logic would have ignored it. But Morrison's map analysis showed this crossing as one of only 4 viable routes for German armor retreating from a sector where Allied ground forces were breaking through. If the breakthrough succeeded, and intelligence indicated it would within 48 hours, German vehicles would have limited options. This bridge was one of them. His squadron commander, now a believer in Morrison's methods, approved the unusual mission. Fly to a crossing where no enemy currently existed and wait for them to arrive. It was the ultimate expression of predictive hunting. Not finding prey where it was, but knowing where it would be before the prey knew itself. They launched at dawn on March 24th, carrying full ammunition loads and external fuel tanks. Morrison checked his map one final time before takeoff, visualizing the terrain, imagining the desperation of tank commanders receiving retreat orders, calculating which route rational fear would choose. They arrived at the river crossing at 07:30 hours. The bridge stood intact, a modest stone span across a tributary that wasn't strategically significant enough to have been bombed. Both approaches were empty. Morrison's flight orbited at 6,000 feet, conserving fuel, watching. 30 minutes passed. The radio crackled with reports from other missions, contacts throughout the sector. The ground breakthrough was proceeding faster than expected. German units were receiving evacuation orders. But Morrison's crossing remained quiet. His wingman, Lieutenant Perry, transmitted the obvious concern. Quail were burning fuel watching an empty bridge. Maybe they took a different route? Morrison had considered that possibility. But his map showed the alternatives. One bridge already destroyed, another in range of Allied artillery, 2 others requiring detours that would expose retreating columns to air attack for extended periods. This crossing offered the shortest route with best cover. "They'll come," Morrison replied. "The question is when." At 08:20, Morrison spotted movement on the eastern approach, not at the bridge itself, but in the tree line 2 kilometers back. Vehicles were staging in concealment exactly as Morrison had predicted. They were waiting for something, probably reconnaissance confirmation that the route was clear, possibly consolidating scattered elements before attempting the crossing. Morrison faced another tactical decision: attack now while they were still in tree cover, achieving surprise but lower accuracy, or wait until they committed to the crossing, sacrificing surprise for target vulnerability. His hunting instinct said, wait. Animals were most vulnerable when committed to crossing. In water on exposed ground focused on immediate movement rather than distant threats. He'd watched deer cross creeks, seen how their attention narrowed to footing and current. Tanks crossing bridges would have similar tunnel vision. At 08:47, the first vehicle emerged from tree cover, a Panzer IV, moving cautiously onto the approach road. Morrison watched through binoculars. The tank paused at the bridge approach, commander probably checking the span's integrity. Then it began crossing. Behind it, the tree line came alive with movement. 1 vehicle, then 3, then a steady stream, an entire company of armor that had been hidden in concealment, now committed to crossing. They were spacing themselves on the bridge approach exactly as doctrine required, enough separation to prevent mass destruction, close enough to maintain unit cohesion. Morrison rolled his P-47 into attack dive. Below him, 17 German tanks were caught in the geometric trap he'd predicted they'd enter 4 hours before they'd known they'd need this route. The attack lasted 8 minutes. Morrison's first pass targeted not the lead tanks. They'd already crossed and could escape, but the vehicles in the middle of the crossing sequence. His .50 caliber fire disabled a Panther at the western bridge approach. The tank shuddered to a halt, partially blocking the exit. The timing was precise. Vehicles behind it were already on the bridge, committed to crossing, with others queued on the eastern approach. The German formation tried to scatter, but geometry became their enemy. Vehicles that had crossed couldn't advance past the damaged Panther. Vehicles still crossing couldn't reverse on the narrow span. Vehicles on the eastern approach had 2 choices: retreat into tree cover or attempt to fight. Several tanks attempted to provide anti-aircraft fire, but Morrison's altitude and angle made tracking difficult. He'd learned that attacking from oblique angles, neither directly overhead nor straight along the axis of retreat, complicated their targeting while optimizing his own firing solution. His flight worked the trapped formation methodically. They weren't trying for spectacular kills. Morrison had learned that damaged vehicles blocking routes were often more valuable than destroyed ones scattered in fields. A burning tank at a choke point stopped 10 others. A destroyed tank in open ground was just statistics. By the time fuel forced Morrison to disengage, the crossing was impassable. 4 vehicles were destroyed or burning at critical points. Perhaps half a dozen more had sustained damage. The remaining German tanks were dispersed back into tree cover, their crossing route compromised, their unit cohesion broken. Morrison's flight returned to base with gun cameras documenting something that military analysts would study for decades. A perfect example of predictive interdiction. Morrison hadn't found this target through reconnaissance or lucky searching. He'd calculated where retreating armor would have to go, had positioned himself before they arrived, and had exploited the moment when necessity forced them into geometric vulnerability. The mission report reached 8 Fighter Command within hours. The tactical implications were immediately clear. Allied air forces had been trying to catch German armor through reactive hunting, responding to intelligence reports, searching known positions, hoping to intercept movement. Morrison had demonstrated preemptive hunting, identifying inevitable routes and waiting for prey that hadn't yet arrived. It was the difference between tracking a deer through the woods and positioning yourself along the trail between its bedding area and water source. The first method required luck and persistence. The second required patience and understanding, but when it worked, it was devastatingly efficient. April 17, 1945, the date that opened this narrative, marked Morrison's final combat mission and the moment when his method achieved its ultimate validation. Intelligence had identified a critical situation. Elements of a German panzer division were attempting to break out of an encirclement near Munich. Their only viable escape route required crossing a river valley where 3 separate approach roads converged at a single bridge complex. High Command wanted the crossing destroyed. Strategic bombers had been tasked, but weather over the target area was marginal. Fighter bombers were on standby. Morrison, now mission commander for specialized interdiction operations, proposed an alternative. Let the bombers stand down. His flight would handle it. The plan seemed absurd. 4 P-47s against a breakout attempt that might involve 50 or more armored vehicles. But Morrison had studied the terrain obsessively. The 3 approach roads ran through hilly terrain with limited alternatives. The bridge complex was the only crossing point for 20 miles. If German commanders wanted to save their armor, they had one option, and Morrison knew exactly where and when that option created vulnerability. His flight arrived at 6:30 hours. The valley was empty. Breakout hadn't begun. Morrison positioned his aircraft in a patrol pattern that gave overlapping coverage of all 3 approach roads. Then they waited. At 0710, movement appeared on the northern approach. At 0725, vehicles emerged on the western road. By 0745, all 3 routes were active, German armor converging on the bridge from 3 directions simultaneously. A desperate, coordinated breakout attempt. Morrison had anticipated this exact scenario. He'd planned his attack not as a single devastating strike, but as a sequence that exploited the convergence pattern. His flight attacked the approaches, not the bridge, disabling lead vehicles on each route at points where their wreckage would block following traffic. The effect cascaded. As approach roads jammed with stalled vehicles, the entire breakout attempt ground to a halt. Tanks that reached the bridge found themselves unable to cross because approaches were blocked. Units still moving toward the valley received no clearance to proceed because the convergence point had become a static kill zone. Morrison's flight worked the trapped formation for 18 minutes, the longest sustained engagement of his combat career, until ammunition exhaustion forced withdrawal. When they departed, the German breakout attempt had collapsed. 50-plus armored vehicles were scattered across a valley that Morrison had identified 3 days earlier as a geometric inevitability. The war in Europe ended 3 weeks later. James Morrison returned to the United States with 37 confirmed armor kills, multiple decorations, and a combat record that military historians still analyze. But his legacy wasn't the numbers, it was the method. Predictive terrain hunting became formal doctrine in Air Force ground attack training. What Morrison had learned in Arkansas deer stands, that you don't hunt what moves, you hunt where movement must occur, transformed how fighter pilots approached interdiction missions. Intelligence sections began dedicating resources to terrain analysis and movement prediction. Mission planners started designating high-probability interdiction zones based on geographic constraints rather than reported enemy positions. The method had limitations. It required terrain with natural choke points, weather that permitted observation, and time that fluid combat didn't always allow. Not every pilot had Morrison's intuitive grasp of terrain or his patience for waiting, but for those who mastered it, the technique multiplied effectiveness by factors of 3 or 4. Morrison himself returned to Arkansas, resumed farming, and rarely spoke of the war. When aviation historians tracked him down in the 1960s, hoping to document his techniques, they found a man uncomfortable with the term ace and uninterested in celebrating kills. What he remembered were the pauses between actions, the slow orbits above European landscape, the quiet concentration while studying maps, the patience required to let certainty emerge from possibility. Wasn't anything fancy, he told one persistent researcher. Just hunting. You learn the territory. You figure what the animal needs. You position yourself where need becomes necessity. Then you wait. City folks think hunting is about shooting. It ain't. Hunting is about knowing. His hunting rifle, a battered .30-30 that had fed his family through the Depression, hung above his fireplace until his death in 1987. On the wall beside it, he'd framed a single aerial photograph, a river crossing in Bavaria, taken from 6,000 feet, showing terrain features that meant nothing to most observers, but that Morrison had read like poetry. The war taught many men many things. Morrison learned that skills born of poverty and hunger, the patient waiting, the careful observation, the understanding that necessity creates pattern, could translate from Ozark hillsides to European battlefields. What the Army Air Forces dismissed as a useless hunting trick became the method that turned one American pilot into the most effective tank killer in theater, by teaching him to hunt not the tanks themselves, but the invisible corridors through which tanks had to travel.